I went to the doctor's one day and he said to me, he took my blood pressure and he said, I don't know how you're walking around. You've got blood pressure that I've never seen it so high in someone who's as young as you are. If you don't make some major changes in your life, then you'll have a stroke before you turn 30.
Hello and welcome to Graduate Theory. My guest today is a communications expert with more than 2 decades of experience in strategic communication and leadership. She was recently recognized in the Leaders Hum 2022 Power List of the top 200 biggest voices in leadership. She also has her own podcast titled This Connected Life. Please welcome to the show today, Mel Kettle.
Thanks so much, James. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today.
It's fantastic to have you on the show today, Mel, and I'm excited to dive into your career and the things that you've done, the things that you teach now as well. But I want to start off talking about your experience before you almost became what you are now. Now you're a leadership communications expert. But I want to talk, what was your career like before you got into this space?
It took me a while to get my career going. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I started out studying economics at university and got 2.5 years through a 3-year degree and went, oh, I don't really like this. Dropped out, went traveling, came back, did a degree in tourism management, loved it, finished that, went traveling. What else do you do with a degree in tourism? Came back to Australia in my mid-20s, and I came back because I was offered a job in a small business organising conferences, and that's something that I'd always been really interested in. And so I took that job, I moved to Sydney, and I absolutely loved it. I worked for this small business for 3 years, and I really credit the owner of that business with helping me start my career in a way that would get me to where I am today. And every time I tell her that, she's highly embarrassed, but it's how I believe she supported me. She really believed in me even when I didn't, and took a chance on me when I had zero professional work experience. All my jobs had been, involving um, money in some capacity. So, in a shop or in a department store or as a waitress. So she gave me this great opportunity, and because we were a small business, we all did everything in the business. So when it came to running conferences, we all had to do the logistics and look at the operational side of it. But we also had to do all of the client meetings, and some of our clients were, the senior leaders of Australia. So one of our conferences we ran was for the ASX, and I don't think there was anybody in the room who was lower than a vice president of one of the ASX top 200 companies in Australia at the time. So really influential, powerful people. Um, but she just had confidence that we would all be able to have conversations with these people. The other thing we had to do with all of the events was get bums on seats. And so this was in the 90s. So social media didn't exist. The internet was just starting out. And which I know you probably find really hard to believe, given that you're quite a bit younger than I am. But there was a time when the internet didn't exist. And so when we were marketing our events, we had to create brochures in hard copy and then post them. So at an international conference, we would be starting to work on 2 years before. And if we didn't get that initial brochure out a year before the event, people wouldn't have time to make arrangements to come to Australia for that conference. So I learned so much in that job and I absolutely loved it. But after 3 years, I wanted more, and there was nowhere else for me to go in that organization because there were only 4 staff. So I was headhunted to a global marketing agency to run all of the events for one of their major clients who was a major player in the tech industry in Australia and globally. And that was a really interesting experience for me. I won that job over a lot of people that had a lot more experience than I did when it came to running conferences. But I got it because I had this all round experience that I'd earned working in my previous role. One of the things that I wasn't prepared for was how exhausting it is to run 300 events in 1 year with a team of
Wow.
And we basically had an event every day, like every Monday to Friday, every day, Monday to Friday for the year. And it was full on. The demands, I can't even explain how full on it was. Um, my team and I did an incredible job. I'm so proud of the young men and women I worked with. I was the oldest, I was 29, and all of my staff were younger than me. Half of them were backpackers who wanted, a cushy part-time job, which they certainly didn't
Mm.
get in this organization
Wow.
or with this project.
Mm.
But I learned a lot, but at the same time, I didn't look after myself. So I was at the beck and call of my client. I was at the beck and call of my agency that I worked with. I reckon I worked an average of 70 hours a week. I traveled a lot and I was just exhausted all the time. And so I got partway through the year and I just started feeling a little bit unwell. And then that sense of unwell, I was eating the wrong foods. I was drinking too much alcohol. I was almost mainlining caffeine, which I knew didn't agree with me. But I had really dodgy stomach. I had chest pains all the time. Um, and I was just completely stressed to the max. And I went to the doctors one day and he said to me, he took my blood pressure and he said, I don't know how you're walking around. You've got blood pressure that I've never seen it so high in someone who's as young as you are. If you don't make some major changes in your life, then you'll have a stroke before you turn 30. And my 30th birthday was about 3 months away. And so it was the wake up call that I
Wow.
needed to start looking after
Goodness.
myself a little bit more.
Yeah, wow. That's phenomenal.
Mm.
But yeah, there's a lot of things I want to unpack through it. Yeah, through
I
that
just did
story
a
that
big
you just
blurt.
explained there.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's okay. There's so much there there's a few things actually that I wanna touch on. So the first of those, and I'd love to like continue your story from there because we're like we have to continue, but there's a few things I want to get to before we
Mm,
continue down that path. The first thing is you said that you moved to Sydney to start this new role,
mm,
and like I've done that myself, and twice now. Like not moving to some place to live for a somewhat extended period. How did that impact you? Is that
mm.
something like the move itself was really beneficial, or do you think the role? Because you mentioned the role at that time as well was really great, and that you got to sort of do a lot of different things. I mean, do you credit the physical move to a new location, having new friends, having to sort of recreate yourself in some way? Do you think that was important at
Um,
all?
I found living in Sydney really difficult. I've lived in a lot of places. I moved to Sydney from Vancouver. I'd
Mm,
moved to Vancouver the year before that. Um, when I was a
mm,
child, we moved around a lot when I was a very small child before we settled in the
mm,
house where I did a lot of my primary school and high school years. And then I traveled and moved around a lot in my early 20s. And so I don't think I fully I think I underestimated how hard moving to Sydney would be. I'd gone to high school in Sydney, so I knew a few people there, but I just found Sydney really difficult to meet a friendship circle of people who I genuinely enjoyed the company of. And that also, I
mm.
worked for a small business and I worked 70 hours a week. So when I wasn't working, all I wanted to do was sleep. And I also wasn't earning very much
Yeah.
money. So I didn't actually have a lot of money to do things that a lot of the people I met could afford to do. Um, so the 4 years I was in Sydney, I was pretty miserable and I didn't fully appreciate how unhappy I was of life in general until I left. And I loved my job and I loved the people I met through that, but they weren't people that I was becoming friends with for a lot of reasons, mostly because they were a lot older than
Mm,
I was and we had a professional relationship. Um, when I left, one of the things that I decided when my doctor said to me, if you don't make some major life changes, you'll have a stroke, I that was just the catalyst for me to realize that not only did I hate my job, I hated living in Sydney. And so I turned back up at work after Christmas that year, and my boss said to me, "Oh, how was your break?" And before I even knew what I was saying, I said to him, "It was great. I quit." And he said
Wow.
to me, What?
Goodness.
What? Are you sure?" And I said, "I didn't think I'd say those words because that's the furthest thing that was from my conscious mind." But the words came out. So, yes, I stand by that. And so I gave about 6 weeks' notice because I didn't know what I was going to do. And within about a week of resigning, I decided that I'd leave Sydney and move to Brisbane. And moving to Brisbane was one of the best decisions I'd ever made. I remember driving across the border of Queensland and New South Wales and thinking, I have come home. And I had barely ever even been to Queensland. So it was just such an unexpected sense of calm amongst all of the chaos that my life had been for the previous sort of 12 to 18 months. And I loved it. Like, I loved living in Brisbane. I met amazing people who became friends within the first week or two of moving there. And I moved to Brisbane 22 years ago. And there's three friends that I made who I would still consider to be three of my closest friends who I met in that first week.
Wow.
And I made I had one really close friend who I met in Sydney, but we met in the last year that I was there, and I couldn't even tell you the names of anybody that I met in my first few years in Sydney
Mm,
because I just found it really it was just such a different environment. Brisbane was so friendly and welcoming and supportive, and people and I think it's because a lot of people had either moved to Brisbane or moved or moved back to Brisbane, having grown up here and left and come back, that there were so many more
mm.
people who understood what it was like to move to a place where you might not know anyone. And so I just felt the welcome mat was really rolled out. Mm,
Yeah, great. Oh,
mm,
that's good. And certainly, yeah, that's so hard when you move to a new place, and then there's just
yeah,
like social connection is so
mm,
important.
it is. Having
So
said
yeah,
that,
that's so hard.
I reckon today it's easier than it was because I moved to Sydney in 2000. So again, internet was just starting, but there was no social media, there was no MySpace, there was no chat. There was some chat rooms, but I didn't really understand what that was at the time.
Mm,
Now you've got social media, so you can get on, your social media platform of choice and say, "Hey, I'm moving to wherever. I'd love to meet some people. Who's there? Where should I live? What suburbs should I look at? Um, what schools could I send my kids to? What cafes are great? If I don't want to work from home or in my office, where should I go? Who are the
mm.
sporting teams?" Like, there's so many things. You can create really strong friendships now on social media before you move to a place. So you've at least got some contacts and some
Mm,
friendly faces when you arrive if you don't know anybody, in the real world.
yeah, definitely. And there's so many of those types of things that yeah available now. Like
Mm,
you said, with the internet, like being able to connect with new people is a lot easier. I'm
yeah.
wondering for yourself. You said when you drove across the border to Queensland, you know, you kind of realized, okay, I'm home. This is the place for me. Like especially once you actually arrived there, you certainly had that feeling. Like, what do you do? You have some kind of a checklist or things that you're like, okay, so this in Sydney was not very good, and this is why, and it's better in Brisbane. Like, there's certain things for you that are really like, this is what I want in a place, if that makes sense.
All I wanted in a place was anything that wasn't Sydney. I was not discerning in
Okay.
any other way.
Wow.
I just wanted something that
Yeah.
wasn't
Wow.
Sydney. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
at the
Wow.
time, my frustrations in Sydney were that everything was so expensive. I wanted to buy a house and I couldn't even afford to
Mm,
buy the crappiest little studio apartment in Sydney. I wanted to meet somebody and, fall in love and have a relationship. And I worked every minute of the day. I've either worked or slept every minute of the day in Sydney. So I
yeah.
didn't have time for that. Um, and the other thing I found really frustrating in Sydney is it just took so long to get anywhere. So I lived in Camaray and I worked at Bondi Junction. And there was one particular day, it took me 90 minutes to get to work, to drive to work, and it was 11 kilometers. And that was the day that I really thought life's
Wow.
too short to be stuck in traffic for this much of a day. And
True.
it
Yeah.
it just all sort of collapsed in on me at once, thinking I just don't. and want to be here. And I also really didn't feel that
Mm,
I had anyone. I didn't feel like I had a lot of support in Sydney, which my family were in Gosford, so they weren't that far away. And my brother was living in Sydney. So I had some support, but I think I just was so deeply unhappy and borderline depressed that I couldn't. The only option that I could see to get rid of everything was to move away from Sydney and start again and kind of reinvent myself again.
mm.
And Brisbane
Yeah, yeah,
helped me
wow.
do
Oh,
that.
and yeah,
Mm,
that's great. Yeah, certainly it's you're working so much. It's you're fairly burnt out, I guess,
yeah.
at that stage, and everything just kind of
Mm,
fell over. You know, what steps do you take now, and what did you learn from that experience when you're working and trying to avoid, this that
yeah.
feeling, right? Where you're working 70, 80 plus hours a week, like you're not exercising,
Yeah.
and then that means that you're gonna have takeout more often, and then you're gonna do other things that aren't healthy more often, and
Yeah.
just kind of always this downward spiral.
I
Yeah,
think
what did you learn from that experience?
I've learned I really need to put myself first and I need to listen to my gut. And if my gut instinct is saying or screaming, this is wrong, do something about it.
Mm,
And it might even be like, it might just be sitting back and thinking, why am I feeling this way? And is it something that's a long term systemic problem or is it a short term problem that's going to go away? In my previous job, yes, we ran a lot of conferences and events, but we took a 6-week break at Christmas. And in the new job, there was no Christmas break. We ran events up until Christmas Eve or until the 20th of December. And then we started again on about the 10th of January. So it was constant and it was unrelenting. The other thing I've learned, like I wasn't sleeping very well at this time in my life, and I would wake up
mm,
every night in the middle of the night thinking, "Oh, I haven't done," and I'd write down a whole list of things I had to do because I just was waking up panicked about everything that I hadn't done. So after that, I put a really firm rule in place. If I had 3 consecutive sleepless nights worrying about work, it was time to quit that job and get something else because that for me, we all have sleepless nights on occasion about when we have, small stresses or big stresses that keep us awake at night. But if for me, if it was 3 or more nights in a row, then that's a really big warning sign for me that something's not right in my life. And and I still have that, and I've used that 3-night rule with boyfriends, with jobs, with clients. And I just think it's your body's way of saying to you, things aren't right and you need to listen.
yeah, I think that's great, and
Mm.
certainly for people listening, it's great to be able to take those things and apply them.
I read this story
Yeah.
recently, which I just love, and it talks about, the universe gives you signs, and at first it will send you a feather, and then it will send you a brick, and then it will send you a truck. And so for me, with my stress and with my burnout, the feather for me was not sleeping, was drinking too much wine, was having my local Thai takeaway on speed dial and calling them 3 nights a week, was just constantly feeling really anxious and then getting chest pains. The brick was when my doctor said to me, "If you don't make a major change in life, you'll have a stroke, pretty soon." I didn't have the truck, but if I'd had a stroke, that would have been the truck because I think, think about what is it that's happening in your world and what are the signs that you're being sent. And, I'm not a
Mm,
woo woo person. I'm highly practical, highly pragmatic, and have a very scientific, methodical brain. But I really believe that there's signs that come to us when things need to be different. And you need to listen
mm,
and pay attention. And I really wish that I had done that sooner. Like, well, even before I took this job, I had a gut feeling that it wasn't the right thing to do, but I was headhunted. I'd never been headhunted before. My ego just went, "Wow," and they offered me a lot more money than I was getting paid. And I pretty quickly realized the money wasn't worth it, but it was too late then. I felt
uh,
like I didn't have any other recourse but to continue with this job. The money's never worth it, by the way. The money's never worth it.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot of
There's a
wisdom there,
lot.
and certainly, yeah, no, definitely. I think it's these one of the whole aims of the podcast, right, is to get these things where
Mm,
have your experience, which is something that probably people don't want to go through,
no.
have that explained to someone who may have faced these. Maybe there's a pathway that you get to in your life where you can go down this path, and so we're trying to say,
Mm.
hey,
So
I've done this before. Don't
I
choose
had
this because, like, here's what's going to happen.
I had planned to move to Mexico for a year, and then this job came along, and I cannot tell you how much I wish I had gone to Mexico for a year. I still never have, but my priorities
Mm,
shifted. But I really believe that there's so many times in our life where we have this fork in the road, and it's like that sliding doors moment, from the Gwyneth Paltrow movie. You can either take door A or you can take door B, and I think that you may ending up where you need to be, but the way that you get there can be really different. And I just think that when you have an opportunity to do something, or when you have two opportunities and you have to make a decision, think really carefully about which decision is right for you, not just today, but longer term as well. And think about, like, I really wish that I'd thought more about how did my decisions in my 20s, how would they make me happy in my 20s? Because I made a lot of decisions in my 20s that made me deeply unhappy. And I can't underestimate enough how important it is to feel joy and be happy with your life, because we've got one life and you need to make the most of it.
yeah, that's great advice, I think. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing because I think it's really powerful, and I hope the people that are listening are really taking that in because you can tell it just comes from your heart, really.
It
So
does.
thanks so
A-
much for sharing that,
And
and
it's
yeah.
also really easy for me to say this with hindsight. Like, I'm in my 50s, and I'm assuming a lot
Mm,
of your listeners will be in their 20s or early 30s,
mm,
maybe. And I know if someone had said that to me when I was in my 20s, I would have just gone, yeah, whatever. But if you just take
mm.
one thing away, then think about what makes you happy and how can you get more of that.
And that's cool, certainly. Yeah.
Great.
I think it's really great what you've shared.
Thanks.
Definitely, I think it's
Thanks.
so important. And I've heard that, like you were saying, what's going to make me happy in the next, short time
Mm,
period might not necessarily be the best option. I've heard that described where if you can just extend the time frame of your decisions, even when it comes to like things like productivity, like I have to have this thing done by this time. Like, okay, let's if we stretch the timeline out to
yeah.
like 5, 10 years,
Yeah.
then now we can really see, okay, this particular day where I didn't maximize like every single
Mm,
last little bit, or where I took the job that would like really, you know. I would have to work really hard, but it, might do this for me or
mm,
whatever.
mm,
Like, if you're trying to get to a certain place in the future, if you just really look you know, then these kinds of things where you're taking certain roads, so it becomes like less important,
mm.
you know,
Um,
like taking a certain yeah.
what you just said there, I think is so important. I think it's really, if you have to make a big decision, I think it's so important to give yourself the time you need to make it and to make the decision when you're in the right headspace. I used to be, one of my past jobs was a media manager in a government department, and I learned really quickly that whenever a journalist rang me looking for a quote, I would say to them, "What's your question? I'll get back to you." So that I could think it,
Mm,
particularly if it was something that was, not great, and a lot of the media I did at
mm,
the time was not great. I just wanted time to be
mm,
able to craft a response that would put my agency in the best possible light, so that, and if it
mm,
was something that was emotional, I needed the time to think through what was I going to say, or what's the most appropriate response that will satisfy them and satisfy my boss. And I think that with,
mm,
and I really learned that It's not only little decisions like that that you should do that to, but all decisions, big decisions especially. And the other time I think it's important to delay a decision is if you don't actually need to make it right now. Like my husband and I moved from Brisbane to the Sunshine Coast last year, and we'd been talking a lot about what we would do when my stepson finished high school. And we started having the conversation when he was in year 7 and just started, thinking through a few, just sort of brainstorming ideas. And then we just parked it and we said, well, we don't actually need to make a decision for another 5 years or really even 7 years or maybe even 10 years. So let's just, touch base and think about where are we at every 2 or 3 years and just sort of assess. And then when the time came, we
Mm.
thought through lots of options and we were a lot more clear on what we wanted, what we both wanted that would work for both of us. And that's an extreme example of
Yeah,
delaying a
great.
decision.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
even if you get a job offer, if you get a job offer for a job that isn't that means you need to move or you need to leave a company that you love or it means some big change, don't feel that you need to say yes immediately. Like take some time. Get ask for references of people who work in the organization. Do your own due diligence before you make a decision. And
Mm.
even as something as simple as getting 2 pieces of paper and writing on one piece of paper all the pros and the other piece of paper all the cons, and then ranking them. What comes out ahead? I really wish I'd done that. There's a
Mm.
few decisions I've made in life where I wish I'd done that. Mm.
Yeah, I think that's a good strategy, and I've used that in the
Mm.
past. Not for many decisions, but one I was deciding to go overseas on exchange actually when I was at university.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, like that. It was like a fairly big decision. Like, am I going to go do this thing? Like, it's quite
Did you go?
significant. And that's what I did. I did go. Yeah, yeah.
Where did you go?
Because on my piece of paper,
Where
I
did you
went to the
go?
UK. I went to Sheffield.
Oh, cool.
Um, yeah, Sheffield is like
Mm.
sort of near Manchester.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
in Yorkshire. But
Yep.
I had my thing, and I was like, okay, pros of this, like, it's going to be a fantastic experience. I'm going to get to like meet new people, go to Europe,
Amazing.
travel around, all that
Yep.
stuff. And the cons was really like maybe I won't get to see my friends for 6 months, which like I was like, okay, whatever. Like 6 months isn't really that long, and then like money as well. I was like, okay, how am I going to pay for this? Like,
Mm.
and that all worked out well as well.
Mm.
So then I was like, well, these
Huh.
clearly the way here is absolutely like this is a rare opportunity. Like, let's make the most of it. And
Yep.
so I ended up going, which I think is good. And I think having that time where you sit down and you say, okay, these are the things, these are the pros, these are the cons, and actually really thinking about it rather
Yep.
than just being like, oh, like, yeah, it's
So
like going almost with yeah, you go.
I'm really curious. You said one of your cons was leaving your friends. When you came home, had anything
Yeah.
changed with your friends or with
Mm.
their lives?
No, no,
And I ask
not
that
really, not
because
significantly.
I
Mm.
was an exchange student when I finished high school. I went for a year and it was something I always wanted to do. And
Mm.
I changed so much in that year that I was in a state of shock when I came home and nothing had changed. I was just like, well, how
No,
come nothing's
yeah.
changed? I've changed.
No, certainly. I honestly, I had a similar experience when I went on exchange because I went away and I was kind of, you know, I was James, and then I went there and I came back and I have this, I have an Excel sheet with my university grades on it, and like I have this, it's like here, like James, and then James goes on exchange, and then after James came back, it's like completely different, like, and it just affected so many different areas of my life.
Mm.
And I'm honestly like super thankful that I did it because it's
Um,
really, yeah, I put it down to like
yeah.
it's probably one of the best things I ever
Mm.
did, to be
Mm.
honest.
It's my year. I went to Canada. My year there was in the top 5 best years of my life ever, and maybe even in the top
Mm,
3. It just it
yeah.
influenced so much of my life. And, I went in 1988. So what's that, 33, 34 years ago. And it still influences my
Mm,
life today. Like there's decisions I make and that I would never have made had I not had that year away. it just opened my eyes
mm,
to the world in a completely different way. Different perspectives, different ways of seeing things, different ways of doing things, different lifestyles. And Canada's and like the
yeah,
UK, Canada, UK, and Australia aren't that really, they're not that different from each other on paper
mm,
until you get there and you realize they are.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think even for me, it was even, getting out of your routines, we were speaking about that before the show, getting out of routines of the ways you do things at home, or in your city or wherever you are, and just having to reset those, and just, like they're just completely gone.
Yeah.
One of my previous guests explained it like this, where you have a bucket of things, and as you go through your life, you're just kind of putting things in, and then when you go overseas or when you go to a whole new place, you kind of just emptying it out, and you get to put things back in, and almost just
Mm,
redesign a lot of that, the ways that you run your life,
I love that.
and to really reflect on what you've done. Yeah, so I think, yeah,
I think the
so
other
important.
thing that was so huge for me when I went is I'd lived in the same community for, most of a lot of my childhood and teenage years. And so there were people who'd known me for a long time who had preconceived ideas of who I was or who assumed that I was something because of how I was as a younger child. And
Mm,
going to a country or a city where you know very few people and nobody knows you is really liberating because you can be whatever you want and you can do things that you would never
mm,
do and take chances and risks that you would never take because nobody knows you. And if it all goes pear shaped and you make a complete fool of yourself, you're not there for very long. So they'll forget by the time you leave.
mm, yeah.
But it's such a
Yeah,
great way
exactly.
to just
I Yeah.
it's such a great way to experiment with, you know, different aspects of life. I love it. Mm.
Mm, yeah, no, definitely. Um, I'd love to, take this conversation to a different different area now, and one thing I wanna ask about is, yeah, your current role, kind of what you do as, communications, leadership, this whole sphere. It's really, really amazing what you're doing, and obviously you've been given some awards for this kind of stuff, so you're clearly really, really good at what you do. But how did you actually, and how does someone get into this kind of stuff where you're presumably you've gone from being an employee somewhere, and then
Mm.
now you've become this person that's, hey, I'm an expert in this area. I think I
Yeah.
can go down this route. I mean, what was that catalyst for you there?
So, when I moved to Brisbane, I worked for a short time for a contract job for the Brisbane Festival, doing the marketing for that big arts festival in Brisbane. Then I did worked for 5 years in the Queensland government, and I remember when I rang my dad and said, "I've just got a job with the Queensland government." He laughed so hard he accidentally hung up the phone because he said, "You're not government material. Like you've come out of corporate and you're not going to cope." And I said to him, I'm going to give it five
Mm,
years. And I lasted 5.5. So I was quite proud of that. But I
mm,
just needed a change. And I had seen dad
mm,
go from government to consulting to working for himself and watched him just blossom and do work that he loved every day. And he and my mum both taught my brother and I that, life is really short. You have to do what you love. And if you don't do what you love with people you love, then you need to make some changes. And that wasn't like that was from big things like who you work with and the kind of work you do through to who you have friendships with and romances with. If you don't genuinely
mm,
love the majority of what's going on in your life, then, you've got control and you've got the power to make it different. And so when I mm, had, reached a time in working for government and working for other people, I just thought there's got to be more to life than this drudgery of going to work every day. And I wanted to work
mm,
part time because I had a lot of other things that I was interested in and wanting to do. And I put an application in to work part time. The head of HR couldn't understand why a woman in her 30s without children would want to work part time. So my application was denied. And so I just resigned. I've never looked back. So I've been working for myself for nearly 16 years, and I love that
Yeah.
it gives me complete freedom and flexibility to choose who I work with, the type of work I do, and when and how I do it. Um, and
Mm.
all of those things have changed a lot in the almost 16 years I've been working for myself. And I've also changed. I've become more experienced. I've become more confident. I'm more confident in asking for what I want. Actually, I know what I want, and I didn't when I
Yeah.
started. And I think that comes with
Mm.
experience and age. You know, as you get older, you become more experienced and you become more confident, and you become more willing to you know your worth more and you know what you value, um, I believe a lot more than you do when you're younger because again, it comes with experience.
Mm.
So I today work with leaders and teams to help them become more connected so that they can create real connection and sustained engagement. And a really big part of the work that I'm starting to do with my clients is to help them become connected to themselves. Because how do you lead others if you can't lead yourself? And if you don't lead yourself first, you're not going to be as effective as you could be at leading a team of people or leading an organization.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of wisdom in there,
Mm,
definitely, and I absolutely agree with a lot of what you've said there. Um, what about like, so your experience previously, with this whole burnout situation, and that whole corporate lifestyle that you were living, yeah, not where you wanted to be at all. How does that reflect now in what you do and what you teach and share? Is there much of a thread that carries on
yeah.
from those kinds of things into what you do now?
So in terms of what I do, I went for a swim at lunchtime at the beach because I could. um, and I really try to live what I teach. Like I'm not perfect at it, not by any stretch, but I really what I'm what I would like what I think is so important. Leaders are so busy today. Like leaders have so many pressures placed upon them, and it's so easy to get caught up in the day to day busy and to get caught up in the demands and the priorities of other people that you forget to prioritize yourself. And I think COVID has really highlighted that for a lot of people that they had some big aspects of their life that they weren't happy with. And I'm not saying that people were happy with lockdown, but I think that when you have to
Mm,
spend when you're forced to spend time with yourself, you reevaluate what you love and what you don't love and what's important to you and what actually do you get up and go to work every day for? Like, why is it that we're doing that? What is it that,
mm,
what's the big benefit or the ultimate that we want from that? And what do we want people to remember us by when we're not here anymore? And I think that I really am trying to help my clients and, you know, the broader world think of those
mm,
things. Like if you were to die tomorrow, what do you want people to say about you? What do you want people to think about you? What do you want people to remember you for? And is what they think of you and remember you for what you actually want to be remembered for? Like, do you want to be remembered as a workaholic who never had time to spend with his kids? Or who was really grumpy at work all the time because you were so stressed? Or do you want to be remembered as this great leader who listened and who genuinely cared and who walked the talk, who said, I don't want anybody here after 6 o'clock. And if you can't do your job in, the time that we've got that's reasonable over the course of a week, let's have a conversation and see what we can change about it. I want to be helping people understand the questions they need to be asking of the people in their lives. Like questions like, what do you need from me to do your job better? What do you need from me to be a better person? What do you need from me to fulfill your goals? And do you even know what your goals are? And if you don't, what do you need from me to help you work out what that might look like?
mm. Yeah, I like that a lot. Certainly, it's a good way of looking at things, right? Is
Mm,
service first rather than you know how can I gain out of this
Oh,
relationship? And instead, it's kind of
absolutely.
flipped, where it's yeah,
And as leaders, we're here to serve. Like, we don't have a job. Leaders can't, if leaders don't have anyone to lead, they're not leaders. So,
mm.
you don't you want the people that are under you in, and that's not the right way of describing it, but don't you want the people who you lead to be looking up to you and to be saying, "I wanna be like that person." And I
Mm,
know we've all had, like, I've had lots of different managers and leaders in my life, and there's some of them that I just remember so clearly. And some of them I remember really clearly because they were amazing and they supported me and they believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And some of them I remember because they were just awful. And
mm,
I don't want anyone to think of me as the awful leader. And although I do know that I will have some past staff who will think of me like that, because we all go through awful
mm,
phases when we don't know what we're doing and we're stressed and we're overwhelmed. Mm.
mm. Yeah, that's important. I think, yeah, to remember that, yeah, you're not a leader if there's no one there to
Mm,
lead, right? I think that's
mm.
really great. Um, what so you've got a book coming out soon, if I'm not mistaken, called
I
Fully
do.
Connected, and I want to ask you about this and kind of tell us a little bit about what the book's about, and in particular, I want to know for yourself if someone's reading this book and going through it, what are some things that you really want someone to take
Yeah.
away from it? Like, what are the key main, like key principles, as you've like that you've learned while
Yeah.
writing it? Yeah.
So the book's called Fully Connected: How Great Leaders Lead Themselves First. And I look at, why do we need to lead ourselves first? What's preventing us from doing that? And then I tell you 3 ways that you can lead yourself first. So you can do that by being more self-aware, and by having a better understanding of what's your purpose, what are your values, what are your attitudes and behaviors, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and how can you capitalize on your strengths? Um, and how do people see you and perceive you? Like, is your level of self-awareness so good enough that you have an understanding of how other people see you as a leader and a person? And then the second thing I talk about is, how do you self-motivate? And, motivation is terrific, but when it comes down to doing the work, motivation tends to take a hike. So what is it that you need to do to first be motivated? And I believe that people are motivated by knowing their purpose, and by seeing what their role is in whatever it is that they want to achieve in the world. But then what do you need to do to take action? And how do you become
Mm,
disciplined enough so that motivation helps you achieve your goals? And then the third part of it is
mm,
self care. So, what is it that you need to do to have a self care toolkit so that you can look after yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally? Because the more self care you have, so self awareness leads to self care, and self care leads to resilience. So if you look after yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally, when things are hard or when things, turn to shit, you're going to cope far better than if you haven't been looking after yourself.
mm. Yeah, I think that's so
Mm.
important. Like you said, it's spiritually, physically, and emotionally.
Mm,
Like all
mm.
those three areas, really, really important. What has been, as you've been researching and writing this book, like what has been the most surprising thing that you've learned through this process? And perhaps it's something you've discovered recently, or yeah, I'm curious to hear like what is something that really stuck out to you while you were researching this book.
Um, One of the things that I experienced in senior leadership roles was that I was really lonely. And I thought that was just me. And it wasn't until I had a whole heap of people, senior leaders and some clients and some friends also say to me, I'm really lonely at work, that I just went, there's a big problem here because
Mm,
we shouldn't be. And so that was something that was really enlightening to me. How do we make ourselves less lonely, but also how do we make sure that our people feel like they belong at work? And what is it that we can do to help them feel valued and aligned to the organizational purpose and aligned to their own purpose, um, so that they turn up at work able to do their best. Because it's one thing to turn up to work wanting to do your best, which I believe everybody does. People don't turn up at work going, I'm going to do a shitty job today. Just you look. Okay,
Mm.
there's probably some
Mm.
people who do that. But for the most part, I don't think people do that. And so I really believe that people turn up at work wanting to be their best and wanting to do their best and wanting to succeed. But I think sometimes they don't know how, and they're often not given the tools to do that, because you can't do your best if you're not given clear directions. You won't do your best if you don't feel valued and if you don't feel that there's compassion in the organization. And you definitely won't do your best if you're really stressed, feeling overworked, feeling overwhelmed, and just exhausted, because it's not possible.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm,
It's that foundation, like you've been describing, I think
mm,
is really, really important
mm.
in so many areas, whether it's your work or just your life
Yeah.
satisfaction generally. I think
Yeah.
if you don't have those three things worked out clearly, then, it's an accident waiting to happen almost. So it's so important that you
That's it.
really look into those areas and think about what you're doing to keep them in good condition.
And it's the
And everything else kind of follows from there.
Exactly. And it's the same with all aspects of your life. You can't show up and be the best person you want to be for yourself, for your partner, for your kids, for your friends, if you're exhausted or overwhelmed or stressed or tired or hungry or hungover or, um, you know, uncertain, unclear. So you were asking me before what would be my advice. I think I've got two pieces of advice for people. Give yourself something to look forward to every day, because when you look forward to something and then it happens, you get this massive dopamine hit and you feel happy. So even if, and I got this idea from a friend of mine during COVID who was in Melbourne in the endless lockdowns. And I said to her, how do you keep going? And she said, every night before I go to bed, I think of something I'm going to do tomorrow that I love. And so I go to bed with this sense of anticipation and joy that tomorrow I'm going to do this thing that I love. And she said, some days it might just be having half an hour quiet time on my own without my husband and kids around, reading a book that I've been wanting to read for a long time. Or it might be planning to spend, some special time with one of my children, or, any number of different things. And she said, none of these things that I do that give me joy take more than half an hour. But that's enough to keep filling my cup and refilling my cup. And so I think that's critical. Actually, there's three things. The other thing, I think, if you haven't been to the doctor in over a year, go and have a health check. Because if there's things going wrong physically, then that will manifest mentally and emotionally as well. But, make sure that your body's in good working order. There's a whole bunch of different health checks you should be having depending on how old you are and what your family history is and how long it's been since you had the last one. So if you haven't, been to the dentist or been to the doctor in over a year, just, have a checkup, get some basic blood tests and see that everything's working, and get a skin check, because, we live in Australia and a lot of people have nasty skin cancers. And then the third thing is, I talked earlier about the feather, the brick in the truck. Have a think about whether there's any of those things happening in your life right now. Are there any feathers that you need to be aware of? Has a feather turned into a brick? And is a brick on the edge of becoming a truck? So just have a think about, what is it that you can do to look after yourself better, because life is really short and hopefully you want to have a really long life that's filled with
Mm.
joy, with people you love, doing work that you love.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that. Yeah, I think that's so important, and that
Mm.
analogy is fantastic. I think
It's a good one, isn't
that
it?
was actually yeah, it's
I don't know
very
where I
good.
read it. I
Yeah.
can't remember. Sorry if it's you who, came up with the idea, dear listener.
Well, yeah, that's going to be my last question, and it's something that like you've sort of already answered in some ways, but something I ask all the guests at the end of the show is, what advice would you give to someone that's just starting out in their career? Like,
Hmm.
given all that you know now, if you had to sort of go wind back the clock and restart things,
Yeah.
what's some advice that you'd give yourself?
Listen to your instincts because they are very rarely wrong. That would be my number one advice. If your gut instinct is saying this isn't quite right, ask questions and listen to it. Mm.
Yeah, I think that's important too. I think, yeah, you've got the mind and the heart, and often
Yeah. And that
combined, they're
heart,
powerful things. So you've got to listen to both.
that mind gut connection, there's so much research now that shows there's such a close link between what happens in our gut and what happens in our brain. And there's some really good books, none of which I can remember the names of. But there's so much research around that. Like the last 20 years has just shown this really strong connection between the mind and the brain and
Mm.
the gut. And so if you're interested, do some research and find out more. But I really believe listen to your instinct. We've all got an instinct. It's like that sixth sense. So, pay attention, particularly if you might call it the spidey senses or the tingles on the back of your neck or your spidey senses. But in my experience, they're not usually wrong.
No, I think that's so important. And thanks so much for sharing that with us today, Mel. Thanks so much for this episode. It's been fantastic to have you on and hear your thoughts. We've covered so much and so much, so much value and really so much wisdom that we've heard from you today. If the audience wants to find out more about you and find out the things you're working on, where is the best place for them to go and find that?
So my website is probably the best place, melkettle.com. It's currently getting overhauled. So if you look at it in the next few weeks, come back about a month later and you'll get to see it nice and shiny and sparkly and new. I'm also really active on most social media platforms. So I love LinkedIn and I love Twitter, trying to love Instagram a little bit more. So yeah, just if you just Google me, you'll find me. And I'm always happy to
Great.
have a chat. If
Well,
you have questions, want to know anything else, please do get in touch.
thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to get my takeaways, the things that I learnt from this episode, please go to graduatetheory.com/subscribe, where you can get my takeaways and all the information about each episode straight to your inbox. Thanks so much for listening again today, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.